very good evening and welcome to Capital Connection, where we join the dots to give you the big picture for business in Africa. I'm Arnold Segawa. On the agenda, Zambian President Edgar Lungu continues to display authoritarian tendencies after the recent suspension of an independent TV broadcaster accused of biased reporting against his government. Apart from locking up political opponents, amending the constitution to extend his presidential term of office, and tearing strips from an independent judiciary when rulings don't go his way, the country is in dire financial straits. Mounting debt combined with low copper prices, Zambia's main foreign currency earner, are taking a significant toll on the economy. We will ask if Edgar Lungu is lining up to become another of Africa's strongmen, as if we need more. Now, after the Democratic Republic of Congo's rigged presidential poll, we saw opposition candidate Felix Tshisekedi announce the winner. This despite overwhelming evidence that the legitimate winner was the former businessman Martin Fayulu. Guess who is back in the frame? That's, of course, in the DRC. Former DRC president for 18 years, Joseph Kabila, is making a return as part of a coalition government. Have the Congolese been played for fools? That's the question. But first, our condolences to the family and friends of those killed in yesterday's Ethiopian Airlines crash. 157 passengers and crew were killed after the Ethiopian Airlines flight ET302 en route to Nairobi from Addis Ababa crashed 6 minutes after takeoff. The cause of the crash is yet to be determined, but the airlines are not taking any chances and are grounding their Boeing 737 MAX and 8 passenger jets. In October last year, the same type of aircraft used by Indonesian air operator Lion Air plunged into the sea off the coast of West Java 13 minutes after takeoff, killing all 189 on board. Joining me now via Skype from Cape Town is the editor and publisher of the Specialist Aviation magazine, SA Flyer. Welcome, and thanks for making time to speak to us, Guy. Let's start this off with the two occurrences, or should I say crashes, with Lion Air last year and what we are seeing right now. The Lion Air incident, many reports are citing a software glitch that fooled the on-air CPU into thinking maybe you need to nosedive and maybe land. Do we know enough to compare the two scenarios?
Yeah, your description is a little bit on the loose side, if I may say, about the Lion Air crash. I think the fundamentals that we need to understand about the Lion Air crash relate to a new safety augmentation system, if you like, a new safety system that Boeing introduced to the latest model, the MAX models. These are designed to protect the aircraft against excessively high maneuvers or very slow speeds. And what happened was that the safety system, the MCAS system, got confused on the Lion Air crash because of bad data coming in, and it pushed the nose down and kept pushing it down until the pilots could no longer raise it, and it crashed into the sea. And this is significant because the similarities are quite strong with the Ethiopian crash yesterday in terms of what information we've got currently from the various ground radar sources, particularly Flight Radar 24, which has tracked the vertical profile of this aircraft, and we can see a similar pattern of it struggling to maintain a steady vertical speed upwards and then eventually literally nosediving into the ground.
Guy, let's talk about what these implications are if you might be an investor or you're sitting on a board or you're a shareholder in a Boeing of this world or Comair. I say that because we do know that Comair made an order for 8 of these in Britain. Holiday operator TUI Airways ordered 32 MAX aircrafts. What does this mean? Just try and give me the economic sense here. If I've placed an order and such information comes in that there might be a glitch going forward on the MAX, what do I do?
Yeah, I think it's an extremely important question because we're only now beginning to understand the size of the fallout from this problem. I noticed that Boeing share prices already, or stock prices already off 10 to 15%, and I suspect it's got further downside in it. The issues become quite subjective, though. is the glass half full or half empty as regards airline safety on these aircraft? Can we trust the American regulatory authorities who put these aircraft through incredibly stringent airworthiness tests before they release them on the market to catch all these bugs? Is this a problem that can be trained out by giving pilot training to sort it out? After the Lion Air crash, I think we like to believe that it could be, and we will need to find out whether this Ethiopian crew was indeed properly trained to deal with an MCAS problem as well. If it wasn't, well, then one could attribute the problem to crew training, perhaps. But beyond that, I think it does pose a huge problem, reputational problem for Boeing and for any other airline that continues to operate these aircraft. I suspect that we may look at a fleet-wide grounding, an entire 737 MAX grounding, either from the FAA or even from Boeing. And it's quite strange that Comair, which has only got one 737-8 operating at the moment, should choose to continue to risk flying this aircraft, given 2 out of 2 crashes so far.
Right, let's talk about some of the competition here. Again, some might find it quite offensive that we are looking at the economic side of things after so many people died. But I just want to get the implications on the likes of Bombardier and Airbus. Is this a chance for them to actually leapfrog Boeing?
Perhaps not so much Bombardier, because their aircraft are significantly smaller than the 737. But Airbus will certainly be making hay while the sun shines, if you like, because the 737 competes fiercely with Airbus's A320 family. They've literally sort of shared this vast market between them. There are 2 new contenders coming into the market, one from Russia and one from China. Those will probably come onto the market in the next year or 2. So that's good news for them. It also puts Boeing under increasing pressure to replace the 737 design, which is now over 50 years old, the basic original design. Look, the MAX is the most modern version of it, and it's hugely different to what it was. But sir, I think that this is extremely bad news for Boeing, because these problems shouldn't happen in this day and age. And need I also just add that it's also extremely sad for African aviation as a whole, because African aviation or African airlines had a reputation as being quite dangerous. They had a safety record as between 3 and 9 times as bad as the world average. But over the past 2 or 3 years, they've really fixed the problem. And in fact, they hadn't had a fatal airliner accident in the past 2 years. So this was their 3rd fatality-free year. And now, of course, it's been ruined by this ghastly accident.
Right. Guy, very briefly, I just want to know, we have got confirmation that the recording devices have been recovered on the site. Very briefly, just give me a sense of, as an expert, what do you think this might actually uncover?
I'm afraid that I'm not optimistic that they're going to get any data out of those flight data recorders. It's remarkable that they recovered them from what was actually available, what was seeable. But whether they're intact enough to provide data would be a near miracle, given the forces of the impact evident from the crater. But obviously, we can only hope that they do get good data from the flight data recorder and from the cockpit voice recorder, because that is what we most need right now. We need information as to what happened this time.
Right, many thanks for that. That was Guy Leitch, the editor and publisher of SA Flyer. Now, the DRC elections may be done and dusted, but the country's former president, Joseph Kabila, appears unable to relinquish control of the mineral-rich nation. Joining me by phone is William Clowes, who is the Bloomberg News Agency's DRC correspondent based in the capital, Kinshasa, and currently on a brief break in London. Welcome, William, and give us a sense if the former president, Joseph Kabila, returning to the power is actually a guise of coalition governments, or is there more to it?
Well, so clearly the elections were disputed, and there were serious claims of fraud in both the presidential elections, which brought Felix Tshisekedi to power to replace Joseph Kabila, and the parliamentary elections, which gave Joseph Kabila's coalition large majorities in both the national and the provincial parliaments. Nevertheless, the fact is that Felix Tshisekedi has been inaugurated as president and is the serving head of state, and his predecessors, political allies, do dominate parliament. Therefore, it's not really a question of whether there'll be collaboration and cohabitation. There will be. It's inevitable, particularly because Congo's constitution obliges the president to pick the prime minister, in other words, the head of his government, from the ranks of the parliamentary majority. And last week, the two alliances, Kabila's and Tshisekedi's, made this more official, and they released a declaration saying that they will govern Congo in coalition. And it appears probable that Joseph Kabila himself will choose the next prime minister, who will need to be formally appointed by the president. It's not yet clear if Kabila will offer Tshisekedi a choice of one, or if Kabila will present the new president with a few options. So while it's important, the nomination of the prime minister is just one round in the horse trading between the two sides. The prime minister and Felix Tshisekedi will then have to set themselves to selecting a ministerial team, i.e. the people who will work for the prime minister. And it'll be very interesting to watch not just how many ministers each side gets, but who gets the key portfolios: mines, defense, finance, interior, and justice. It'll be very interesting to see if Kabila's allies, retain hold of these ministries, or whether Tshisekedi's people are able to get their hands on these very important portfolios.
William, let's talk about some other forces that are very, very strong in the Congo. One is Moise Katumbi, the other is Jean-Pierre Bemba. These are very strong forces, and they did back the presidential candidate Fayulu, who, of course, as we know, lost. Tell me, where do they fit in this particular puzzle? Just give me a sense of whether or not you see Felix Tshisekedi also kind of finding a spot for Fayulu in the grand scheme of things.
So both men, Bemba and Katumbi, have, as you said, they supported Martin Fayulu, but they've both been rather quiet since the election took place and since Tshisekedi was inaugurated. The coalition that supports Moise Katumbi has the second most seats in parliament and has recently said it won't join the government, but has begun to make noises that sort of suggest they can live with the Felix Tshisekedi presidency, something Martin Fayulu has refused to do. And amongst other things, Katumbi's coalition has called on Tshisekedi to allow him to return to the country because, of course, he lives in political exile at the moment and was being targeted by various legal cases that he says were politically motivated, but he has got a prison sentence if he returns. So it looks as if Katumbi perhaps is trying to arrange some sort of accommodation, ensuring his return to the country. With Bemba, it's much more difficult to say, because some of Fayulu's most vocal political supporters during the campaign were top Bemba officials, and they seem to be still more on the same page with Fayulu than perhaps the Katumbi people, but they haven't said anything particularly clear and defined in recent weeks.
Right. Finally, another piece of the puzzle is Emmanuel Ramazani. You did mention something very interesting on the ministers. Now, definitely former President Joseph Kabila has a very strong hand in whatever transpires in the next 5 years. Do you get the sense that Emmanuel Ramazani, being very, very close to former President Kabila, do you get the sense that former President Kabila might secure something for him, being a loyal servant over the years?
On that, I couldn't say. There are a number of people who have been linked with the Prime Minister's position in the local press and sort of in gossip in Kinshasa. Ramazani's name does crop up sometimes, but not as often as other times. Nonetheless, he will remain influential because he heads Kabila's party, and Kabila's party is by far the biggest in the ruling coalition. And so whether he gets a ministerial position or the prime ministership or no position in the cabinet team, he will be the formal head of the biggest party in parliament. So, yes, he didn't win the presidency, but he remains a figure of influence.
William, many thanks for making time to speak to us. Let's take a short break, but after the break is the Zambian President Edgar Lungu following a well-worn path towards authoritarianism. Up next. Welcome back to Capital Connection. Now, Zambian President Edgar Lungu is displaying some tendencies that does not augur well with the country's democratic credentials. Joining me is Southern Africa's Regional Director for Human Rights Organization Amnesty International, Deprose Muchena. Deprose, many thanks for making time to speak to us.
Thank you very much.
When Edgar Lungu came into the thick of things, many were actually quite excited, thinking it's a time for economic growth and each and everything that we had not particularly seen in the past. Tell me, how is he faring thus far?
Well, that usually happens whenever there is a new dawn in any country. The expectation goes through the roof for a country that was going through all manner of problems. So I think, of course, there was the expectation that President Lungu would deliver the various promises Zambians were looking for, in particular addressing the triple burden of unemployment, of poverty and inequality, and improving the human rights situation of the country. What we are facing now is a completely different picture, with a deterioration, especially in the human rights context of the country, which is something that Amnesty International has been monitoring for a couple of years now.
Deprose, if we're to look at the strong men, as we've come to know them across the continent, there are some traits that kind of act as a preamble. Do you get the sense that the approaches that President Lungu is taking on right now are actually warning signs to the likes of Museveni, maybe the Paul Bias of this world? Is he heading in that direction, given the characteristics that he's displaying now?
Well, I think what I can only say is to compare President Lungu and the Zambian authorities using their own standards, their own laws, their own constitution. But indeed, yes, across the continent and region, we face the emergency of a particular governance architecture, which instrumentalizes the state and reduces expression of freedoms. A governance architecture that does not want to see competition of ideas, and a governance architecture that promotes use of violence to target citizens that are unarmed. And in particular, we've seen this across the region, and we continue to speak out against this. With respect to Zambia itself, the most worrying things is what's happening to the space of expression for media and journalists.
Deprose, let me just take you back just a bit. Institutionalization of the state, using state instruments here.
Yes.
Just give me some examples here.
Okay, so what we see is, first of all, the inability to break with the past. So you still see in Zambia the mobilization of colonial era legislation, such as the Public Order Act, continuing to be on the statutes of the Zambian authorities in terms of how they govern the country. And then the deployment of that Public Order Act in the same way that it was deployed by the British before they left the country, which is to target those you don't like. Target nationalists in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, now target people perceived to be opposition, civil society, and others who are speaking out against corruption, misgovernance, and who are calling for broader transparency of the country. We have seen that, for example, with targeting of musicians, artists like Pilato, integrity campaigners like Laura Meat, who have been saying we should procure goods and services in a transparent way, targeted with the Public Order and Security Act. With respect to media, we have seen the deployment of the Independent Broadcasting Authority, which is neither independent nor acting independent in terms of how they execute their mandate. We've also seen the use of the Zambia Revenue Authority in the case of the Post when it was closed in 2016 because it was owing revenues or unpaid taxes. We've also seen the use of the Zambia Information Communications Technology Authority, which has fueled a series of very questionable defamation cases against people who use Facebook and so on. So this deployment of institutions of the state to achieve a political objective tends to undermine credentials of the country and increases country risk factors, which investors look at with citizens begin to retreat from public spaces because of fear. And what then happens is only the one view coming from the state that becomes the dominant narrative of how Zambia manages its own governance. And this needs to change because Zambia can do better than that.
And often the apparatus that is deployed here strongly is the state broadcaster, at least on the media space. But I want to take you to another kind of a trait that we have been seeing in the past few years is with the emergence of social media and new media, we have seen the strongmen try to move to curb the power of social media by at least cutting off. We've seen it in Zimbabwe, we've seen it in Ethiopia, we've seen it in Uganda, usually coinciding with either riots and election day. Has he moved in this particular direction? And many argue this is done to arrest the effects of the Arab Spring as it was.
Yeah.
Have we seen it in Zambia?
Yeah, well, we will see signs of that. In 2017, I think 35-year-old Edward Mackay was targeted for Facebook posts. Dr. Kafunya was also targeted for Facebook posts and probably still languishing in prison. These are actions taken to send a chilling message to freedom of expression campaigners and ordinary people to ensure that if you go on Facebook, you must praise dear leaders. You must only speak the language that is consistent with national narrative given from State House or state broadcasters like ZNBC, which are never subjected to the powers of the International Independent Broadcasting Authority that we are seeing being deployed on Prime TV and in 2016 Movie TV, Combon Radio, Itesh Radio. These have been subjected to the same tactics.
Deprose, sorry to just cut you short there. If you're telling me that someone was targeted for posts or is a social media activity and is now languishing somewhere in prison, where does Amnesty International come into such? Are you actually making a case for some of these? We've seen cases in the Middle East where journalists for Al Jazeera and other news agencies are actually thrown in prison for months on end. Where do strong civil rights activist groups like maybe Amnesty and the likes come in to make sure that these people's cases are heard, or let's not even rot in prison?
Yeah, well, we are constantly working with governments to ensure that we communicate the message of the central importance of a rights-respecting society to governance, to economic development, and to building inclusive society. In 2017, in October, we met with President Lungu in his office and members of his cabinet to communicate to him concerns that we had about freedom of expression, but also about mining activities and how they're excluding citizens and communities from beneficiation.
And what did he have to say?
Well, we had a lengthy conversation. We made commitments to caring and to resolving some of these problems. And we specifically raised the issue of appealing to him to cancel and get rid of the Public Order Act because it was not consistent with modern society. And he said that he was looking for input to come from Human Rights Commission, civil society, and that the government would move as soon as they have concluded their consultations. We have not moved from the promises that he made. And so it's very important that Zambia recommits itself to human rights obligations under domestic law, but also under international law, because continuing to create this fear society that has emerged is not helpful. So we are working with government. We also want to work with civil society to support them, because Amnesty does investigative work. It also does promotional work for human rights education and protection mandates. And so we should work actively to prevent violations from happening. But once they happen, we should also work actively to ensure that there is redress. And that's what we are doing in Zambia.
Deprose, finally, let's talk about this fear politics. Is this a move to consolidate power? And if so, where is SADC in this grand scheme of things? I say that because in the past you have heard a collective song being sung, at least by regional blocs. And if someone gets out of line, I'm using the example of the East Africa community, Burundi got out of line, and all the other member states, all the other presidents said, you know what, there's a problem here, we need to address this. South Sudan, no exception. So the East Africa community there may be looking like a poster child, but where's SADC in this grand scheme of things if President Lungu is clearly taking matters into his own hands.
Yeah, the East Africa community, but also the West Africa community, ECOWAS, they have demonstrated a commitment to holding each other accountable for obligations that each of them have agreed upon. Not so with SADC. We still have a huge lack of appetite to call a spade to each other across Southern Africa. We've had bigger problems. In Zimbabwe, we've had the DRC election outcomes. We've had the deteriorating human rights context in Zambia itself. But SADC leaders somehow are unable to stand up and rise up and call each other to account. SADC citizens, on the other, are working very actively together to ensure that SADC responds. So one hopes that continued advocacy and dialogue with leaders and demonstration that we can do better as a region will ultimately result in SADC beginning to take action on these key questions of governance, of human rights, and of creating inclusive societies for all of us.
Right, and that's where we'll leave it for this edition. Many thanks to my guest, Deprose Muchena, who is the Southern Africa Regional Director for the human rights organization Amnesty International, and also to all my other guests on tonight's show. And we do look forward to seeing you again on Capital Connection, of course, at 6:30 p.m. Central African Time every Monday and Wednesday. And once again, may we offer our condolences to all those who lost their loved ones aboard Ethiopian Airlines Flight ET302. From us, have a good night.